My father didn't give a toast at my wedding reception. He gave me a bill. He stood up right after the cake was cut, buttoned his gray suit jacket, and tapped a spoon against his water glass 3 times. Ting, ting, ting. The sound carried across Bayfront Union Hall, over the low music, over the clinking forks, over the soft laughter of people who still believed the night was about love. 118 guests turned toward him. My new husband's mother still had a napkin pressed under one eye. My bouquet was lying beside my plate, white roses and eucalyptus, already starting to wilt at the edges. My father, Russell Mercer, looked calm. That was the worst part. He looked like a man about to read a warranty policy, not destroy his daughter's wedding. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a stapled packet printed on Mercer Appliance and Repair letterhead. The same letterhead he used for broken dryers, leaking dishwashers, and overdue service calls. Then he walked to the head table and placed it in front of me, between my champagne glass and the slice of almond buttercream cake I hadn't touched yet. "Before my daughter starts a new life," he said, "she needs to settle the old one." The room went still. Owen's hand found my knee under the table. I looked down at the first page. Invoice. Cost of raising Lila Ann Mercer. Total due. $196. For a second, I heard nothing. Not the music. Not the whispers. Not my mother's chair shifting at the family table. Just the dry paper sound of my childhood folding itself into one final bill. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him why. I just looked at the invoice, the way I looked at every suspicious medical claim I had ever reviewed at work. Line by line. Charge by charge. Lie by lie. Because what my father didn't know was simple. He had brought an invoice to my wedding. So had I. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. 1 week later, nobody in my family was talking about the flowers, the cake, or the way Owen cried when I walked down the aisle. Owen and I had postponed our honeymoon for 2 weeks because his facility was short-staffed, so I was home when the calls started. By the following Saturday, Mercer Appliance and Repair had stopped sounding like a business and started sounding like a courthouse hallway. Customers still called about dryer belts and refrigerator parts, but between those calls came cousins, church ladies, old neighbors, and people who had sat 3 tables away from my wedding cake and heard every number with their own ears. They were not asking about my father's invoice. They were asking about mine. Russell Mercer did not like being questioned. He liked being believed. For most of my life, people believed him automatically. He was the man with grease under his fingernails. The man who fixed widows' washing machines at a discount. The man who sponsored pancake breakfasts at my mother's church. The man who told everyone his daughter moved to Pittsburgh and got too busy to remember where she came from. It was a clean story. A useful story. It made him look wounded and made me look cold. The problem with clean stories is that they do not survive receipts. My Aunt Celeste called that morning while I was standing in our kitchen, still wearing Owen's old sweatshirt, watching coffee drip into the pot one dark line at a time. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Honey," she said, "your father told us you never helped. He told all of us that." I looked out the window. A wet maple leaf was stuck to the glass, trembling every time the wind moved. "I know," I said. There was a silence on her end. Not empty. Heavy. I believed him. "I know that too." She started crying then, quietly, like even her apology was ashamed of taking up space. After we hung up, I stood there with the phone in my hand until the screen went black. Owen did not ask what she said. He just set a mug beside me and touched the back of my neck once, gently, the way you touch someone who is still deciding whether she is safe. My mother called twice. I did not answer. Nolan texted once. "You made Dad look like a criminal." I read it 3 times, not because it hurt, but because it was so perfectly Nolan. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry he did that at your wedding." Just damage control, just the family name, just the mess I had supposedly made, by refusing to be humiliated quietly. At 11:14 that morning, I opened my banking app. There it was, the automatic transfer I had set up 3 years earlier because my father said the shop needed predictable support. $1,500, scheduled for the first of every month. It had survived rent increases, wedding deposits, and every quiet promise I had made to stop next month. My thumb hovered over the button. Cancel recurring transfer. No music swelled, no one clapped. The dishwasher hummed. Owen turned a page of the newspaper. Somewhere outside, a truck backed up with 3 sharp beeps. I pressed cancel. Recurring transfer canceled. I stared at those 3 words longer than I had stared at my wedding dress in the mirror, because that was the first bill I ever refused to pay. But to understand why my father thought he could hand me a $196,000 invoice in front of 118 people and expect me to lower my head, you have to understand the house I grew up in. In that house, love was never free. It came with a service fee. I learned that before I learned long division. I was 9 the first time I understood it clearly. It was my birthday, a cold February evening in Erie, the kind where the windows fogged at the edges, and the furnace coughed like an old man trying to get through one more winter. My mother had made a sheet cake from a box mix and written my name in pink frosting. My brother Nolan had already dragged one finger through the corner and blamed it on the cat, even though we did not have a cat. My gift was a red winter coat. Not fancy, not designer, just warm, with silver snaps and a hood lined in fake fur. I loved it before I even put it on. I remember sliding my arms into the sleeves and feeling, for one whole second, chosen. Then my father reached for the paper tag still hanging from the cuff, turned it over, and read it out loud. $49.95, he said. Don't lose it. That was all. My mother was at the sink, rinsing plates that were already clean enough. She did not turn around. She only said, "Your father works hard, Lila. Remember that." So I remembered. I remembered the price of my school shoes, because Russell circled it on the receipt and tucked it under the magnet on the refrigerator. I remembered the monthly clarinet rental, because every time I practiced, he would tap the kitchen table and say, $21 a month ought to sound better than that. I remembered the doctor's copay when I had bronchitis, because he set the receipt on the dashboard during the drive home and said, $35 for them to tell us you need soup. I tried to swallow every cough after that, not because I was better, because I was embarrassed. The house behind Mercer Appliance and Repair always smelled like machine oil, dryer lint, and coffee left too long on the burner. The front of the building belonged to customers. The back belonged to us. But even there, everything had a number. Heat, groceries, toothpaste, field trips, birthday candles. When I was 13, I found my mother's recipe box. It was yellow, with tiny painted lemons on the lid, the kind of thing a woman brings to church potlucks and bridal showers. I opened it looking for her brownie recipe. Inside were index cards. One had Nolan's name at the top. One had mine. Mine said dental cleaning, $74. Band uniform deposit, $45. Lunch account refill, $30. Prescription, $12. Birthday cake, $18.75. I put the cards back exactly where I found them. I closed the lid. I never mentioned it. By 14, I had stopped asking for things. Not because I was humble, but because every request felt like handing my parents another reason to regret me. I did not know then that one day, my father would put that regret on paper and ask me to sign it. But before he ever put a signature line in front of me, my father spent years teaching me the language of debt. Russell Mercer believed every family had a balance sheet, whether they admitted it or not. He just thought he was honest enough to say it out loud. He owned Mercer, Appliance and Repair, on a tired block on the west side of Erie, wedged between a tax preparation office and a laundromat that always smelled like hot metal and detergent. The sign out front was blue and white, hand-painted by my grandfather before I was born. By the time I was old enough to read it, the paint had cracked around the word Mercer, but my father refused to replace it. "Things don't need to be pretty to work," he used to say. I didn't understand it then, but he would spend most of my childhood treating people the same way he treated machines: useful, broken, or costing too much to keep. Customers loved him. He could keep a 20-year-old dryer alive for one more winter. He fixed widows' washing machines at a discount and let church members pay late when he knew they were short. Men at the diner called him old school. Women from my mother's Bible study called him dependable. He wore cracked knuckles and grease under his nails, like proof that nobody had the right to question him. At home, old school meant something different. If Nolan broke a window throwing a baseball in the driveway, my father shook his head and said, "Boys test the world with their hands." If I dropped a glass while washing dishes, he pointed at the pieces and said, "That came in a set of 6. Nolan could fall asleep on the couch with homework unfinished because he had been helping at the shop. I could spend 3 hours answering phones after school, matching service slips to invoices, and still be told I needed to contribute more. Nolan was the son who stayed close to the machines. I was the daughter who looked past them. My father noticed that early, and he did not forgive it. He never said girls couldn't run a business. He was too careful for that. What he said was worse because it sounded reasonable. Lila's book, smart. He would tell customers when I was standing right there. Nolan's practical. Then he would clap Nolan on the shoulder like practicality was a crown, and intelligence was a phase I needed to outgrow. My mother, Marin, softened him for public use. At church, she organized casserole sign-ups, counted donation envelopes, and mailed sympathy cards before the funeral flowers had wilted. People trusted her with cash boxes and prayer requests. They thought softness meant kindness. I used to think that too. At home, she trusted my father with the truth. If he said I was ungrateful, she lowered her eyes. If he said Nolan needed support, she called it family duty. If he made a cruel remark, she called it stress. If I reacted, she called it disrespect. For years, I thought my father was the problem, and my mother was trapped beside him. It took me much longer to understand that silence can be a kind of signature. In our house, Nolan's mistakes became emergencies. My needs became expenses. My ambition became evidence that I thought I was better than everyone else. That was the story my father started telling long before I left Erie. And when I was 17, and a letter from Pittsburgh arrived with my name on it, he finally found a way to turn that story into a document. The letter came in April, thin and white, with the University of Pittsburgh seal printed in blue across the top. I found it in the mailbox after school, tucked between a grocery circular and a water bill. For 10 seconds, I just stood on the cracked back steps behind the shop and held it. I already knew what it was before I opened it. My hands knew, my stomach knew. Some part of me, that had been holding its breath since 7th grade, knew. I got in, not just accepted. I got enough scholarship money to make it possible, if the financial aid forms were completed on time. The deadline was 9 days away. That was the part nobody puts in the happy movie version. Dreams still need tax returns. Freedom still needs a parent's signature when you are 17. I put the letter on the kitchen table after dinner. My father read it without sitting down. My mother stood at the stove, stirring soup that had already started sticking to the bottom of the pot. Nolan leaned against the counter with a bowl of cereal, watching like this was a show he had not paid for but planned to enjoy. "Pittsburgh," my father said. Just the word. No congratulations. No pride. Not even surprise. "That's 3 hours away." "It's a good program," I said. My voice sounded too careful, even to me. He set the letter down. "So that's the plan? We raise you, and you disappear?" "I'm not disappearing," I said. "I'm going to school." My father laughed once, not because anything was funny. Then he went into the shop office and came back with a sheet of paper on Mercer appliance and repair letterhead. The same paper he used for service estimates, overdue balances, and customers who needed reminding. At the top, in bold, it said "Family Reimbursement Promise." I read it twice. The language was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. Russell and Maren Mercer had invested substantial financial resources in the upbringing of Lila Ann Mercer, and upon achieving stable employment, Lila would make reasonable reimbursement to the family. There was a line for his signature. There was a line for mine. "It's not legal stuff," he said, sliding a pen across the table. "It's respect." I looked at my mother. She kept stirring. The spoon scraped the bottom of the pot in slow, tired circles. I was 17. He had the tax returns. He had the FAFSA information. He had the power to miss one deadline and call it an accident. So I signed. Not because I agreed. Because sometimes the door out of a burning house is held open by the same person who lit the match. Nolan smiled over his cereal. "Guess you better get a good job," he said. That night, I packed for college with one suitcase, 2 trash bags, and the understanding that my freedom already had interest on it. I left Erie in August, with that signed promise folded inside a folder I did not open again for a long time. Pittsburgh felt enormous to me then. Not because it was New York or Chicago, but because nobody there knew what I cost. Nobody in my dorm knew about the red coat, the recipe box, or the way my father said my name when a bill came in. For the first few months, I let myself be just another freshman carrying a laundry basket down a hallway that smelled like detergent and microwave popcorn. I worked because I had to. Cafeteria mornings before class, library desk on weekends, data entry 3 nights a week for a small clinic in Oakland that still used fax machines like they were sacred equipment. I learned to eat cheap, sleep light, and stretch $1 until it made noise. I bought used textbooks with highlighting from strangers. I kept granola bars in my backpack because sometimes lunch was a luxury and sometimes pride was cheaper than a meal plan. The clinic job was where I first saw medical billing up close. Explanation of benefits, deductibles, co-pays, denied claims, adjustment codes. At first, it looked like another language designed to scare people into paying without asking questions. Then I started understanding it. A wrong digit could cost a patient hundreds. A missing modifier could turn a covered visit into a collection letter. A bill could look official and still be wrong. That mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. After graduation, I got hired by a hospital system in Pittsburgh as a billing compliance analyst. My first desk was in a windowless office with beige walls and a chair that squeaked every time I leaned back. I loved it anyway. Numbers had rules. Paper had trails. If someone claimed a balance was due, there had to be proof. Not feelings. Not guilt. Proof. My first real paycheck felt like oxygen. Distance changed the address of the pressure. It did not remove it. 3 weeks later, my father called. The service van needed a transmission. He did not ask if I could help. He said the van was how he kept the shop running, and the shop was how my mother kept health insurance, and family stepped up when family could. I sent $1,200 that afternoon. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself decent daughters helped. Then came my mother's dental crown. $2,850. Then a parts supplier threatening to freeze the shop account. Then property taxes. Then a shortfall after what Russell called a slow winter. The amounts changed, but the calls all sounded the same. No greeting that stayed warm for more than 15 seconds. No question about my life that did not eventually bend toward money. At first, I saved the confirmations because I was organized. That was all. Screenshots from Zelle. Bank statements downloaded as PDFs. Text messages where my father wrote things like, "Need this handled by Friday or your mother is worried sick." I named the folder Mercer Family Support because I still wanted the word support to mean something clean. Every time I sent money, I waited for a thank you. Not a parade. Not repayment. Just one sentence that proved they knew I had given something up to help them. It never came. By the 3rd year, I had stopped waiting, but I had not stopped sending. I added a spreadsheet because that was what my work had trained me to do. Date, amount, requested by, purpose, method, running total. I told myself it was professional habit. I did not know I was building evidence. Not yet. I learned what the evidence meant on a Thursday afternoon in March. I was at my desk in the hospital compliance office, eating pretzels from a vending machine bag and reviewing a stack of denied outpatient claims, when my phone buzzed with a number from Erie. I almost ignored it. Unknown Erie numbers usually meant one of two things: a patient account routed wrong, or my family finding a new way to reach me. I answered because habit is harder to break than love. "Is this Lila Mercer?" a man asked. "I'm calling regarding the delinquent commercial balance attached to Nolan Mercer's account." For a second, I thought he had the wrong person. Then he read my email address as the backup contact. Mine. Not my father's. Not my mother's. Mine. I sat very still. The man kept talking. Parts invoices. Late fees. A credit line opened for equipment. A missed payment on a truck lease. A weekend charge in Atlantic City my father had once described to me as a vendor networking trip. I wrote the numbers down on the back of a claim denial form because my hand knew what to do before my heart did. That night, I called my mother. "Was the 18.5 for the service van actually for Nolan's truck?" I asked. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the refrigerator humming in her kitchen 3 hours away. "Your brother has had a hard time," she said. That sentence did something to me. Not loudly. Nothing broke on the outside, but inside, some old shelf finally gave way. "Mom, he stayed, Lila." 2 words. That was the whole defense. He stayed, so his mistakes became loyalty. I left, so my paycheck became repayment. He ruined customer accounts, missed payments, ran up balances, and somehow the family emergency was always my responsibility. I sat on my couch in Pittsburgh with my work badge still clipped to my blouse and understood that I had not been helping my family stay afloat. I had been bailing water out of a boat where my brother kept drilling holes. Thanksgiving confirmed it. Nolan was in my father's recliner, beer balanced on his stomach, football flashing blue across his face. I walked past the kitchen doorway and heard him laughing with a cousin. "She's got hospital money now," he said. "She can afford it. Hospital money. Not work. Not sacrifice. Not years of eating cheap and sleeping less. Just money that existed because I had escaped." I drove back to Pittsburgh that night without turning on the radio. When I got home, I opened the spreadsheet and added a new column. Used for. Then I started filling it in. Store expense, Nolan debt, unverified, lie. That was the first time I understood what my spreadsheet was really showing me, but it was not the first time someone showed me another way to live. I met Owen Callahan in an elevator that got stuck between the 3rd and 4th floors of St. Bridget's Medical Center. He was holding a toolbox in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. I had a stack of disputed billing reports pressed against my chest, and the kind of headache that made fluorescent lights feel personal. The elevator jerked, stopped, and made a sound like an old man clearing his throat. Owen looked up at the ceiling and said, "Old buildings have memories. Sometimes they just complain out loud." I laughed before I meant to. That was how it started. 4 minutes between floors. A maintenance manager with kind eyes, and a crooked name badge. Me, still measuring every inconvenience by what it might cost. Owen did not sweep into my life like rescue. I would not have trusted that. He came in slowly. Coffee after shift, lunch in the hospital courtyard, a walk along the river when the weather finally warmed. He asked questions without turning them into inspections. When I said I needed to work late, he did not make me prove it. When I paid for my own dinner the first 3 times, he did not make a speech about pride, he just noticed. The first time he took me to his parents' house in Brookline, I nearly ruined the evening by asking the wrong question. Beatrice Callahan opened the door before we knocked. She was 66, a retired nurse with soft gray hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of hug that did not ask permission but somehow still felt safe. Her husband, Hal, stood behind her with a dish towel over one shoulder and flour on his shirt, even though Beatrice later told me he had only been trusted to slice bread. Their house smelled like garlic, laundry soap, and lemon furniture polish. There were framed school photos in the hallway, a chipped ceramic bowl for keys, and a stack of mail on the counter nobody seemed ashamed of. Dinner was lasagna, salad, warm bread, and too much food for 4 people. Afterward, Beatrice packed leftovers into 2 plastic containers and handed them to me. I froze. "How much do I owe you for the containers?" I asked. The kitchen went quiet for half a breath. Not judgment quiet, not embarrassed quiet, just surprised. Hal looked at Owen. Owen looked at the floor like he understood something he wished he did not. Beatrice set the containers down, reached across the counter, and touched my wrist. "Honey," she said, "food isn't a loan." I had to look away. It was such a small sentence. Almost nothing, but it landed in a place inside me that had been locked for years. In my father's house, leftovers meant waste calculated backward. In my mother's kitchen, generosity always had a memory and a number attached. At Beatrice's counter, food was just food. Care was just care. Owen did not ask about my face until we were in the car. "My family keeps score," I said. He started the engine, then sat there with both hands on the wheel. "In mine," he said quietly, "we try not to keep score with people we love." He did not heal me that night. People do not undo a childhood with one warm meal and a plastic container of lasagna. But he gave me a comparison. And sometimes, comparison is the first crack in a lie you were raised to believe. That crack widened slowly, over years of dinners, holidays, and small ordinary kindnesses I did not know how to receive. By the time Owen proposed, on a cold October evening with a simple ring and no audience, I had learned enough to say yes before fear could itemize the future. We planned the wedding ourselves. Not because Owen's parents refused to help, but because every time Beatrice offered, some old reflex in me reached for a calculator. So we kept it modest. Bayfront Union Hall, September 21st. White tablecloths, string lights, chicken, pasta, salad, and a cake from a bakery owned by one of Owen's residents' daughters. Nothing extravagant. Nothing my father had paid for. That mattered more than I wanted to admit. 2 months before the wedding, my Aunt Celeste called from Dayton. We usually spoke on birthdays, Christmas, and the kind of family emergencies that arrived wrapped in guilt. This time, her voice was careful. "Lila," she said, "your father told people you haven't helped much since you moved to Pittsburgh." I was sitting in my car outside the hospital, one hand still on the ignition. "He said that?" "He said he and Marin gave you everything. And now you act like you made yourself." There it was. The story, polished and passed around. I had been sending money for years, and somehow I had still become the daughter who forgot. The week before the wedding, Owen and I drove to Erie and checked into a small hotel near the bay instead of staying at my parents' house. My mother called it unnecessary. My father called it city behavior. I called it a locked door. Russell was cheerful that week, which was worse than anger. He whistled in the shop. He slapped Owen on the back too hard. He kept touching the inside pocket of his suit jacket, like a man checking for a winning lottery ticket. Then Priya saw Nolan at FedEx. She called me from the parking lot, her voice low. Priya was my oldest friend in Pittsburgh, and a paralegal, which meant she could smell trouble before it was notarized. "He's printing something," she said. "A packet. I saw the title page." I closed my eyes. What did it say? Mercer Family Reimbursement Statement. That night at the rehearsal dinner, my father stood up with a glass of iced tea and smiled at the room. "Raising Lila," he said, "was the biggest investment Marin and I ever made." The word landed hard. Investment. Owen leaned close. "Was that supposed to be a joke?" I watched my father touch his jacket pocket again. "No," I said. "That was a warning." Later, Priya found me by the hotel ice machine. "Bring paper to a paper fight," she said. And for the first time, I understood my wedding reception was not going to be a celebration to my father. It was going to be a collection attempt. I did not sleep much that night. Owen did. Not because he did not care, but because Owen had the clean conscience of a man who did not build traps for people he claimed to love. He fell asleep on his back in the hotel room, one arm thrown over his eyes, breathing steady while the little wall unit rattled beneath the window. I sat beside him with my laptop open, the blue light turning the room into something colder than it was. I had three choices. I could confront my father before the wedding, drive to Vine Street, knock on the door, tell him I knew about the packet, and threaten to leave if he tried anything, but that would only give him time to move the ambush. Russell Mercer did not abandon a debt. He just changed the collection date. I could ignore it. Let him stand up, let him hand me whatever Nolan had printed, smile for the room, and pretend we would discuss it later. But silence had cost me too much already. In my family, silence did not protect peace. It protected the person doing harm. So, I chose the third option. I prepared. I opened the folder I had been feeding for years. Bank statements, Zelle confirmations, check images, screenshots of texts from my father, voicemails I had transcribed after long nights when his words would not leave me alone. A picture of the family reimbursement promise. Priya's photo of the FedEx receipt. Every piece looked small by itself. Together, they had weight. I created a new file and named it Mercer Reimbursement Audit. Date, amount, requested by, stated purpose, actual use, if known, payment method, acknowledged. That last column stopped me. Acknowledged. I scrolled through years of transfers and filled it honestly. No, 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 no. Not one thank you attached to a receipt. Not one message that said, "We know this cost you something." Just requests, emergencies, reminders, and the soft violence of being expected. At 1:42 inches the morning, the total appeared at the bottom of the sheet. Monthly support. $139,200. Emergency payments. $61,940. Nolan-related debts. $27,500. Gran total. $228,64. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. My father was planning to bring a $196,000 invoice to my wedding. By his own logic, I had already overpaid by $32,640. At 2:08, I went downstairs to the hotel business center in sweatpants and Owen's hoodie. The printer coughed awake like it resented me personally. Page after page slid out warm with toner. 14 pages, clean columns, clear totals, no insults, no pleading, just proof. On the cover page, I typed, Reimbursement Audit, Funds paid to Russell, Marin, and Nolan Mercer, September 2016 to September 2024. Prepared by Lila Mercer, Billing Compliance Analyst. I placed the pages in a plain white envelope. In the morning, before hair and makeup, I handed it to Priya. She looked at it once. "What is this?" "Insurance," I said. She slipped it into her clutch without another question. That was the thing about Priya. She knew when a woman needed advice, and she knew when a woman needed a witness. The wedding itself was beautiful, in the way simple things can be beautiful, when nobody is trying to own them. The church smelled like wax and old wood. Owen's hands shook when he said his vows, and when he promised never to keep score with my heart, I heard Beatrice let out a small sound from the front pew. My father walked me down the aisle with his arms stiff under my hand. For 30 seconds, under the colored light from the stained glass, I let myself pretend he was just my father. Then, I felt the shape of the packet in his jacket. By the time we reached Bayfront Union Hall, I knew the day had two versions running side by side. In one, Owen and I were married. The cake was almond buttercream. Hal was teaching my cousin's little girl how to do the twist, and Beatrice kept pressing tissues into everyone's hands like it was her official job. In the other, my father sat at the Mercer table with one hand, resting over his inside pocket, waiting for his moment. It came after the cake. Russell stood slowly, tapped his spoon against his glass, and let the room turn toward him. He started warmly. He always did. He said Marin, and he were proud of me. He said I had built a career, found a husband, and started a life any parent would admire. Then his voice changed. But beautiful lives don't appear out of nowhere, he said. Somebody pays for them. Owen's hand tightened around mine. My father pulled out the packet and placed it in front of me. The first page read, Cost of raising Lila, Ann Mercer. Total due, $196,000. Underneath were categories typed neatly enough to look official. Food, clothing, utilities, transportation, medical premiums, school expenses, emotional support, and parental guidance. $14,000. That line almost made me laugh. Almost. I opened the packet slowly and read it the way I had read thousands of bad bills at work. Since you brought a bill to my wedding, I said, I'm going to process it like one. The room went quiet enough to hear the ice shifting in someone's glass. I started with the hospital charge. I marked it unsupported. I moved to food, then clothing, then medical premiums. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him. I just corrected the record line by line until my father's face lost its color. Then I turned to Priya. Envelope, please. She crossed the room and placed the white envelope in my hand. I set my audit beside his invoice. For 8 years, I said. I sent money to my parents and my brother. No loan agreement, no interest, no repayment schedule. I sent it because I thought that was what family did. Then I read the totals. Monthly support, $139,200. Emergency payments, $61,940. Nolan-related debts, $27,500. Gran total, $228,64. I looked at my father. Your invoice says I owe you $196,000. My records show I paid $228,640. By your math, Dad, you owe me $32,640. For once, nobody in that room tried to fill the silence. The silence lasted long enough for my father to understand that the room was no longer his. Russell's hand gripped the back of an empty chair. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again. For the first time in my life, he looked less like a man presenting a bill and more like a man reading one he had not expected to receive. We made you, he said finally. His voice cracked on the word made. I kept my hands flat on the table, one on his invoice, one on mine. No, I said. You raised me. Those are not the same thing. Marin stood first. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together like she was holding back a prayer or a confession. Nolan pushed his chair away so hard it scraped across the floor. You humiliated us, he said. I looked at my brother. No, I documented you. That was when Hal Callahan stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He was 69 years old, a retired firefighter, and he had the kind of quiet that made people listen. A child is not an invoice, he said. Nobody clapped. It was not that kind of moment, but something in the room shifted. My father felt it, my mother felt it. Even Nolan felt it, because he stopped looking angry and started looking exposed. They left through the side door before the DJ knew what to do with his hands. For a moment, I sat there in my wedding dress, listening to the door close behind them, and I thought the night was over. Then Owen squeezed my hand. I stood, smoothed the front of my dress, and turned toward the DJ. Play something people over 50 can dance to. He blinked twice, then put on September by Earth, Wind and Fire. Hal was the first one on the floor. Beatrice followed, crying and laughing at the same time. Priya grabbed my hand. Owen spun me so badly, I nearly stepped on his shoe. The reception did not become perfect again. Perfect was gone, but it became ours. The calls started 3 days later. Celeste apologized. 2 cousins did too. Everett Sloan, one of my father's oldest customers, left a message saying Russell had bragged for years that I paid whenever he called. I saved that message, then never listened to it again. My mother called once. You could have handled it privately, she said. So could Dad, I answered. She hung up. The next morning, I canceled the automatic transfer. $1,500 a month stopped leaving my life. I opened a new savings account and named it Home, not Debt. I never collected the $32,640. I did not want his money. I wanted my name back from his ledger. Months later, Beatrice handed me leftovers after Sunday dinner. I started to say I would bring the containers back. She smiled. Bring yourself back. That's enough. And for the first time, I believed her. I never repaid my childhood, because childhood is not something a child borrows. But that night, I finally stopped paying interest on a debt that was never mine. What Lila's story teaches us is that love should never arrive with a balance due. A real family may struggle. They may need help. They may lean on each other during hard seasons, hospital bills, broken cars, lost jobs, and frightening months when money does not stretch far enough. That is part of life. That is part of loving people. But there is a difference between asking for help and building a cage out of guilt. There is a difference between gratitude and repayment. There is a difference between raising a child and treating that child like a long-term investment that finally matured. Children do not borrow their childhoods. They do not sign a contract when they are born. They do not owe their parents for food, shelter, school clothes, medicine, or the basic care every child deserves. And when a parent uses those things as leverage years later, what they are really saying is not, "I loved you." They are saying, "I kept score." The painful truth is that some people will call control family. They will call manipulation respect. They will call your boundaries selfish because your silence used to benefit them. And when you finally stop paying, apologizing, explaining, and shrinking yourself to keep peace, they may accuse you of being cruel. But sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is stop funding the wound. Lila did not win because she embarrassed her father. She won because she refused to become him. She had the proof. She had the numbers. She could have demanded every dollar back. But instead, she chose peace. She chose a home that was not built on debt. She chose a future where love would not come with an invoice. And maybe that is the lesson. Healing is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like canceling one transfer, closing one door, keeping one boundary, believing, finally, that you do not have to repay people for surviving them. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been made to feel like love already you da already just a Your story might help. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.